one of the many worlds in the universe, began to crumble into tiny pieces. The situation spiraled out of control the moment the pillar that held everything together collapsed. In his quest, the hero had to cross many spheres and thousands of worlds. Each of them collapsed into small shards. Each time it was necessary to create everything anew. The hero had to take on the burden of caring for humanity. A temple was built on a small island hovering high in outer space. A young man in a blue robe sat in a lotus posture in the sky and meditated. From the outside, it looked like he was hanging on an invisible carpet just in the air. He was destined to awaken in the primordial chaos and become a teacher for humanity. He sat with his eyes closed and felt bursts of energy around him. The hero sat like that for a while longer, building up energy before he considered the awakening timely. The young man began to slowly open his eyes. The energy artifact located on the roof of the pagoda reached its peak. There was a massive release of energy, and the stronghold of civilization exploded. This led to the fact that the hero was also thrown from heaven to earth, and he had to create a new world here. The islet, along with the pagoda temple, moved leisurely across the firmament. The young man thought that this place would be suitable and opened the portal. On the other side of the portal, things looked different. His pagoda moved into the earthly celestial space, and the portal immediately closed. The day was sunny, and green fields with forests spread wide below. The hero himself did not know what was in store for him this time. Perhaps he would become the greatest ruler of mankind. He imagined building a temple for himself the size of a city, and all the power of the world would belong to him alone. Suddenly, another thought crossed the hero's mind. He thought that he could raise a worthy successor and find a man worthy to rule this world. But there was another possibility. There was no need to fight. The hero saw himself towering over a mountainous, rushing river. He immediately dismissed the idea. The hero stood on the pillar of civilization, which at the same time was instead of a pedestal for him. He gazed dreamily into the distance and admired the landscape. After a while, the white-haired young man closed his eyes. He had to concentrate on what was important, and nothing was to distract him. The azure robe fluttered in the gusts of wind. The hero shouted to the sky that all he needed was a girl apprentice to rub his master's back. It seemed very easy to accomplish. Unfortunately, the first student turned out to be a young and strong macho man dashing around the neighborhood with his sword. The third apprentice turned out to be a shota, and that too made the hero sad. This was not an option for him either. He needed a girl. Of course, the question arises as to what happened to the second student. He was a very handsome student who outshone his beauty and smiled playfully. But the hero had to by no means succumb to temptation and not let his mind be clouded and fall for a smarmy face. The blonde-haired world dweller clasped his fingers together and prayed, asking the heavens where he could find the one and only female student who could meet his needs. Suddenly, somewhere in this dimension, as if responding to the hero's call, a certain girl looked around warily. She had light pink hair with a strange style. The girl was wearing a rather daring dress. With her high self-esteem, she couldn't help but notice that someone behind her back was praising her charms. The moon hung over the city. Night had fallen. The stars glittered alternately in the darkness. Ominous clouds thickened over the night city. Not everyone in the city was asleep at this late hour. The girl the hero had chosen to be his apprentice was practicing hard at night. She was fleeing from pursuit and running as hard as she could. The girl's face flushed red with exertion, sweat beading on it. Meanwhile, the men who were chasing her knew no fatigue at all. They chased her along the roofs of the houses, occasionally taking to the air. After running across another rooftop, one of them pushed off and habitually soared into the air. The man wore dark clothes. His face was concealed by a hooded mask, a sword hanging behind his back. It couldn't go on like this for long, and after a while the stalker was almost on par with the girl. When he was above her, he began to draw his sword. The girl ran on in a huff. Out of the corner of her eye, she saw that the man was close by. She could do nothing. He was clearly moving faster. The girl was only distracted for a moment. It was enough for her to catch the toe of her boot on a small boulder in the road. The moment the girl was already falling to the sidewalk, the stalker flew even closer and landed on the roof of a small house right above her. The second man began to dive at the girl. With one hand, he began to draw his sword. The stalker put his other hand in the girl's direction. The agitated girl immediately turned to face the man and covered herself with her hands. She begged to be left alone. At the moment when death seemed imminent, there was a sudden clang of blades. Their swords crossed in a duel. The girl trembled and awaited her fate. At the moment of impact, she was sure that her soul was on its way to heaven. The girl could not believe that she was alive, and she opened one eye incredulously. Finally, she realized what was happening. Her eyes opened very wide with surprise. She stared at her savior in amazement. A tall, dark-haired man in a straw hat and dark clothes with brightly colored gold inlays cut in at the last moment with his sword. The girl looked puzzled at the men's fight. She was already sitting on the sidewalk, her fear of near death beginning to fade. The stranger in the straw hat was concentrating on holding back the onslaught of the enemy. Swords clashed against each other, and the pursuer could not cope. Suddenly the man made a leap forward, and the pursuer flew backwards in surprise, letting go of his sword. He fell on his back right next to his partner, discouraging him from continuing the fight. The second pursuer realized that their forces were unequal. He helped his partner up and said they had better leave. The stalker turned around on the run and told the man in the straw hat that they would meet again. The girl tucked her legs under her and looked at her accidental savior with embarrassment. A slight blush appeared on her cheeks. She marveled at how quickly the stranger had dispatched his pursuers. The girl marveled at how quickly the stranger had dispatched the pursuers. Several months had passed since the unpleasant incident. The moon had risen, illuminating one of the estates enclosed by a tall yellow fence. Above the central gate was a large plaque with large hieroglyphics that could be seen from afar. The spiders had made their home nearby. The girl with pink hair was relaxed and was taking her bath, humming a song in a contented voice. Her knees were sticking out of the water. It felt so good to be in the warm water that she closed her eyes in pleasure and threw her head back. When she had finished her bath, the girl finally allowed herself to open her eyes. Her heated face was crimson, and drops of water were dripping down her hair. The girl began to reluctantly leave her wooden tub and rested her hand on its edge. The water from her wet hand slowly dripped down the surface of the tub. As she began to wrap herself in the white sheet, the girl couldn't contain her wat-song and exclaimed how good it felt to take a bath. Covering herself from the front with a sheet, the girl climbed out of the tub. She felt nice and good. The mood was wonderful, and the girl kept humming a song. The girl's naked body was clearly visible through the open window of the house. The streetlights provided enough illumination for that. The observer took advantage of this. He quickly sketched the silhouette of a half-covered girl walking away with a pencil on a piece of paper. The artist turned out to be a fair-haired hero. He sat comfortably on the roof of the house opposite, with his legs hanging down, and watched the object of his attention, drawing her from different angles. The result of the hero liked the result very much. He could not contain his pleasure and lustfully licked himself. His eyes lit up with excitement. Suddenly, the blonde-haired hero had to stop drawing his sketches, and he didn't quite like it. A certain young man in white clothes with brown hands knocked on the girl's door. The girl did not open the door, and he kept knocking. He was a tall young man with pink hair. He was dressed in white golden clothes and held a sword with a scabbard of the same golden color in his hand. His name was Tao Er. She recognized her older brother's voice and asked him embarrassedly to wait. She hadn't had time to get dressed yet. The girl recognized her older brother's voice and asked him to wait. Embarrassed, the young man didn't seem to hear her and continued to bang on the door. He waited impatiently for the girl to open the door for him. Finally, Tao peeked out from behind the door, wrapped in a white sheet. She said hello to her brother and asked what he wanted from her. The girl invited her older brother into the house and quickly made a hot drink for him. They sat at a small table. The young man expressed his concern that Tao Er had decided to stay here and said that he would like to meet her savior. He hinted that this place was quite remote. Tao assured that her brother really had nothing to worry about. That gentleman is really very strong and can protect her. The young man reproached his sister for being too naive. She had not recognized the man at all, but she began to bow to him and call him mentor, which was all he had been waiting for. Tao assumed that the Lord had taken on her training because the girl was unusually gifted. The young man objected that they hadn't seen a single disciple in a few days. Besides, absolutely nothing is known about this temple of heavenly will, and he is worried about Tao Er. Mentor decided it was time to show himself, got down to the ground and walked into the house. He stopped at the threshold and coughed delicately, drawing attention to himself. The girl immediately jumped up, greeted him cheerfully, and rushed over to him. The young man remained seated near the table. His sword lay beside him. Master said hello to Tao Er and Mr. Su. He noticed that it was quite late and they were still awake. Su bowed to his mentor as a sign of special respect and said hello. He hesitated and did not know how to explain his visit to his sister at such a late hour. Ji Yan admitted that he had heard about what was troubling Mr. Su. He couldn't afford to give up the Tao Er he had found with such difficulty. The blonde-haired mentor coughed meaningfully again. He had to buy a few seconds and think of something. He explained to Su that the temple was rather deserted now, as he had only accepted personal disciples since the founding of his teachings. Jie Yan smiled welcomingly and told him that by happy coincidence, a few of them would be returning to the temple today. He told Tao Er that tomorrow her master would introduce the girl to his senior students. Tao Er was embarrassed and blushed again. The next day, Yan kept his promise and led Tao Er and her brother Su to his temple high in the mountains. They walked along a mountain path among the rocks. Around the beaten path, everything around them was blooming and green. Su found this place very strange. Something rustled in the bushes. The brother and sister immediately turned their heads in excitement. Su grabbed his sword. A young man in white and blue robes and gray pants suddenly jumped out of the thicket. He had a sword hanging behind his back. The young man took one leap to the nearest tree, quickly ran up its trunk, and sat down on a branch, viewing the guests from a safe distance. Yan waved his hand in a friendly manner. He assured Yuling that he didn't need to be afraid. It's just his little sister student, and no one is going to harm him. Lin felt sick to his stomach. He turned pale at the thought of his mentor bringing a sissy who would be studying with him. Tao Er embarrassedly waved her hand to greet him and said that she was happy to see him. Yulin's worst fears had come true. This creature was a woman after all. He shouted angrily and ran away. The girl looked at the young man with a puzzled expression. She couldn't understand what had scared Lin so much. The girl turned to her mentor and asked him who this strange student was. Su also looked at Yan with interest, and he told a short story. It was one of his apprentices, 20 years ago, who had gone to earn money. The young man was caught during the 9 Fei and was used as a living elixir for alchemy. Yan added that all the juices had been squeezed out of him. Of the 200 jin of weight, only 120 were left. So now the young man was frightened by the sight of the girl, so he ran away. Su snorted. It was disgusting to him that the witches from the 9 Heavens current were involved here. Tao Er didn't understand a word of the story. Yan said enviously that his disciple had served as an elixir for a crowd of young beauties for 7 whole years. Looking at the faces of his companions, he corrected himself and said that it annoyed him. The 3 of them walked through the courtyard. Yan said that they should cross the gallery, and young Tao happily followed her teacher. A small, thick tree stood in the middle of the courtyard. On one side of the tree were stones. On the other side of the tree, a young man was leaning on the trunk of the tree, which caught Su's attention. A young man in a brown cloak stood in the shade of a tree chewing on a blade of grass. His appearance was concealed by a straw hat. Yan walked ahead and told his companions that they now had to turn the other way and invited them to follow him. Tao caught her brother's gaze and turned toward the tree as well. Seeing the young man, she tugged the teacher's sleeve and asked with interest who the strange young man standing under the tree was. Yan assured the girl that there was no need to pay much attention to that person. It was just her senior classmate, Mo Junhen. The master recalled one of the fights with that young man and regretfully narrated that Junhen's head was not right. It turned out that the young man constantly fantasizes about being the first fencer in the Celestial Empire. Although in reality, Junhen is unable to even withstand Yan's own attacks provided they fight on equal footing. Tao Er couldn't contain her amazement. She involuntarily moved even closer to her mentor and expressed her delight. The girl embarrassedly exclaimed that she hadn't even thought of such a master's power before. Yan found the girl very seductive and opened his mouth. He couldn't be happy that he had found such a charming little girl to apprentice with. The master's eyes were burning with desire. Su carelessly pointed towards Junin and asked what that warrior was doing now if he was meditating. Jianhen had been covertly watching them all this time. He slightly lifted his straw hat for a better view and snorted contemptuously. Su kept turning around and looking at Mo. The mentor said that Jianhen wasn't doing anything at all right now. He turned around, gave Su a friendly smile, and explained that he usually called people with this behavior show-offs. Tao assumed that both students had their own peculiarities. Su said that peculiarities was still too soft-sounding. After a while, Master Yan stopped with his hand behind his back and announced that he would now introduce the highlight of the program to them. He turned to his brother and sister, and hesitantly said that in a certain sense this man could be considered quite normal. The mentor knew that that student was actually the most unique, and one could only hope that he wouldn't cause more trouble. Passing the gallery, they found themselves again among thick grass and trees. Yan said that there was another person ahead whom he wished to introduce to Tao Er. Su frowned. He saw that this place was too strange, and the disciples themselves are worthy of each other, one more abnormal than the other. Su saw that his little sister was getting too excited about all this, and thought that he would have to take Tao Er away from here after all. The master smiled and waved at them in a friendly manner. Yan said that they had reached their goal, and had come to the right place. Tao opened her eyes wide with delight. She immediately liked this place. Everything was beautiful and unusual. In one corner of the garden in front of them, a sakura bloomed. The girl had never seen such a fanciful color of its petals before. There was also a small pond, and fish of various names were splashing around, occasionally surfacing to meet the rays of the sun. Across the pond, a zigzag path on stilts led to a small gazebo. There was someone sitting at a small table. An oblong, 6-stringed instrument was placed on a table, and the man sitting in the gazebo was musing on it in an inspired manner. It was a girl with ash-colored hair tied in a ponytail with a green cloth. Smiling, she strummed the strings, and the melody echoed sadly throughout the neighborhood. The girl closed her eyes. It was easier for her to adapt to the musical rhythm. The girl extracted notes that penetrated into the soul, and everyone listened to the melody, holding their breath. Tao Air opened her eyes wide and exclaimed that the girl was simply beautiful. She thought that she would have fallen in love with her if she were a young man. Yan just stared. He knew what kind of girl this was. After all, it was his own disciple that he was going to introduce to the girl. Su was also amazed by the performer of the music. The music sounded not bad at all, but the girl was really a real beauty. He walked closer and realized that his hunch was correct. Su had not seen such a beautiful girl for a long time, and it would be nice to be friends with her. All three of them approached the girl who was playing. When she saw them, she immediately stopped playing and put her instrument aside. The girl bowed politely and folded her hands in respect. She said hello to the master and smiled warmly. Tao kept exclaiming that the girl was very beautiful. Yan told Bai Yulan that this was his youngest fellow student, Su Tao Air. She would be the master's new apprentice. Pointing his finger at the young man, the mentor said that he was Tao Air's elder brother, and he was also an honored guest of the Temple of Heaven's Will. Bai gently looked into Su's eyes and thanked him for the visit. This did not go unnoticed. The young man blushed and said hello to the young lady. He began to tell her that his name was Su Xuan, and he was a figure from the capital. Suddenly, Tao Air slapped him hard on the back. Surprised, Su was silent for a while and turned to his sister in surprise. She said that Su had gotten too nervous. The brother started to guffaw and joked that he hadn't even noticed it himself. Bai smiled. The girl said that the sister disciple could call her Tao Air from now on. She couldn't resist complimenting Bai that she was pretty. Lan smiled and said hello to her. Bai Lan looked in front of him and smiled at his brother and sister. He kept waiting for them to figure out what was wrong on their own. But they were both completely confused by his appearance. Lan turned his head faintly toward his mentor and looked at him with a sidelong glance. Yan reluctantly noted to himself that he understood the reason for his gaze. Bai wanted the master to delicately point out their joint mistake to the guests. Yan regretfully recognized that it was time to end the performance. The mentor covered his eyes and coughed delicately, drawing attention to himself. He called Tao Air over to him and said that there was something she needed to know. Master smiled and said that in fact, Bai Lan was not really her fellow sister at all. Su didn't pay any attention to his words. Tao was very surprised. Master Yan added that Lan was her brother-in-law. Bai stood there, playfully twirling his hair around his finger. The brother and sister were furious. They had both been taken in by a handsome young man just because he had a pretty face. And if Tao Air was just disappointed, Su was just tearing his hair out in frustration. He couldn't believe that he had almost fallen in love with the young man's face. Tao automatically almost called him her sister. She corrected herself and asked the brother student if he was actually a guy with that appearance. Yan explained that Bai Lan looked like a girl from birth. He asked him to remember it well, and not to make the same mistake in the future. Su almost cried. His face creased with annoyance. He asked Lan if he was sure he was really a guy. Bai Lan winked at him coquettishly and assured him that it was actually true. He had been a guy since birth. Su couldn't hold back the urges of his stomach, and he vomited. The young man was disgusted with himself for thinking such thoughts about Bai. It was good that he had managed to move a little to the side. Tao Air immediately came running to his aid and asked what was wrong with him. Su was red with tension and said that he was fine. He was actually angry with himself. After all, Lan's appearance had made his heart beat harder, and Su couldn't forgive himself for that. Su turned to the master and told the abbot that the time was not early, so he and his sister would go rest for now. Tao waved goodbye to her master and apprentice brother on the run, almost calling him sister again. Bai Lan and Yan smiled. Master reminded the girl that class would start early tomorrow morning and asked her not to be late. As soon as the guests left, Mentor Yan frowned. Bai Lan continued to smile peacefully. He was amused by the situation. Master Yan turned to him and asked the young man sternly if he had memorized well all the things his mentor had warned him about earlier. Bai folded his hands in appreciation and bowed to his mentor. He said that he understood absolutely everything. Yan didn't have to worry. The master warned Lan to never show his true nature or scare his little sister apprentice, or else he would get a reprimand. Yan turned around and said that he had to go and finalize some preparations. An excited Bai Lan wished him a happy journey. It was morning at the Temple of Heavenly Will. All the disciples gathered in the center of the octagonal platform with the yin and yang symbolism in the center. Yu Lin was hiding behind one of the pillars closer to the brick wall of the temple. Mo Junin leaned on the other side of it, pulling his straw hat over his eyes. Master sat down in the lotus posture and solemnly announced that he would teach the spiritual comprehension of Tao Air starting this very day. Yan explained by way of introduction that people aspiring to become celestials could be on one of the 7 stages, and listed them by name. Tao Air was hiding behind one of the pillars, and the mentor frowned. Traditionally, master and apprentice were supposed to sit opposite each other. Yan told the girl that she was too far away from him, and therefore would not be able to hear her master's instructions clearly. Tao Air peeked out with one eye from behind the pillar. The girl's face was red with shame. In a stammering voice, she clarified whether the clothes were definitely Taoist robes. Junhen and Lin watched the girl surreptitiously. Tao asked indignantly why the socks were so long and the skirt too short in this outfit. The mentor looked at her condescendingly and smirked. He told Tao that there was still a lot she didn't understand, so she thought it was strange. Yan said that this Taoist garment was the personal creation of her master. It took a lot of mental and creative effort to make it. The mentor noticed that Tao started to hesitate and pressed on. He added that there was no need to reject the master's benevolence. The girl noticed that Yan was starting to get angry and gave in. She said that she trusted her mentor and would wear these clothes if it was so necessary. The embarrassed girl sneaked out from behind the column. Still, she felt that the clothes did not conceal anything and that it was indecent to walk in them. This Taoist garment had an overly wide neckline, held together by one honest-to-goodness and one button fastened at the very throat. The skirt, on the other hand, was so short that it was necessary to constantly cover oneself with one's hand to avoid indecent stares. Stammering, the girl still told her mentor that this garment made her very uncomfortable. She felt out of place. Tao Er's face turned the same shade as her hair with embarrassment. Tao Er's face was the same color as her hair, and she almost cried in embarrassment and begged the master not to wear the dress. The mentor had told Tao that this form had a positive effect on her cultivation, and she would realize it herself. The sight of Tao did not leave Yan indifferent, and his nose bled. The girl sat on one of the designated seats on the platform in the lotus position and covered the hem of her dress with both hands. She said that even so, she felt restless. Mentor sat down opposite her in the same assigned seat and folded his legs under him as well. They sat in silence for a while. Tao, burning with shame, looked down at the floor. Finally, she looked up and asked the master if wearing this uniform could really help her training. She realized for herself that it was uncomfortable for meditation. Wiping away the blood with the handkerchief he had saved beforehand, Yan noticed that Tao had put on her uniform incorrectly, and so it was creased. His eyes lit up with intense desire. Tao offered to do his best to help smooth out those folds. After a while, the sky darkened and rain clouds appeared. A few minutes passed, and the first drops of heavenly moisture fell to the ground. The training at the Temple of Heavenly Will continued. Mentor Yan told the new novice about the history of the temple and its teachings. At the same time, Su leisurely strolled along the stone-paved path that led to one of the gates that opened the way to the training ground. Suddenly, someone called out to him from behind, and Su was alert. From the voice, he thought it was the guy from yesterday who looked like a girl. It was indeed Bai Lan. The young man held a fan in his hand. Smiling, he asked what reason had prompted Mr. Su to come to this place. Su was embarrassed. He couldn't look at Bai's face calmly. He explained that he suddenly remembered something very important, and he needed to discuss it urgently with Tao. Su confessed that he actually wants to take his sister away from here, but the girl is determined to stay and won't listen to anything. Turning his back to Lan, Su clenched his fists and strode away. Bai looked at the young man in surprise. He had interrupted their conversation so abruptly. Su told him that he couldn't stay and protect his sister all the time. This time he would just say goodbye to Tao. The embarrassed girl was standing in front of her mentor at this time. Kneeling down, Yan licked greedily and adjusted the folds on the hem of Tao dress. Fortunately, Su didn't see any of this and only intended to enter the set. He told Bai that he didn't have to worry about Tao because she was perfectly safe here. Su was already close to the temple door and reached out his hand to open it. But Bai's sudden call to stop confused him, and he froze in place. Su turned around and saw that Bai Lan had swung his fan at him and intended to hit him. He tried to calm down Brother Lan and raised his hands in a friendly manner. A confused Su asked Bai what was going on and the reason for his aggressive behavior. The Lan hesitated and began to think of an urgent reason to keep Su inside. Bai winked conspiratorially at Su and put his finger to his lips, urging him to shut up and take it on faith. Lan turned to Su politely. He clarified that the master was now teaching a class, and he would be very upset if an outsider found out about his effective techniques. Su couldn't just stare at the young man's face. He blushed and admitted that Lan was completely right and he had been too rash in his decision. Bai Lan was glad that he was able to change his interlocutor's mind so quickly and take his side. He shook Su's hand firmly in gratitude. Lan said that such an occasion was rare and suggested walking together for a while. Without waiting for a reply, he pulled Su in the opposite direction. A thoroughly embarrassed Su stopped himself from thinking that Bai Lan was a guy after all. He blushed all red from internal tension. He didn't understand how Bai Lan could be a young man with such a graceful, girlish figure and such long, lovely hair. Bai's voice interrupted him from his thoughts. He was kindly noticing that Mr. Su was sweating too much. Su was indeed covered in sweat from worry. Not only his face, but also his hands were inordinately moist. He noticed that he was not used to the climate here. Lan asked Mr. Su to stand still and not move. Meanwhile, he went under the folds of his clothes. Lan took out a purple handkerchief, walked closer to Su, and asked Susan's permission to help him. Lan reached for Su's face with his handkerchief, and this caused the young man to be even more confused. He was simply thrown into a fever. Lan extended his hand with his handkerchief and at the same time winked playfully at Su. The young man noted that Lan's eyelashes were too long, making him look even more like a girl. Su suddenly bounced back. He couldn't afford such incomprehensible displays of kindness. Lan dropped the handkerchief from his hand in surprise. Su immediately announced to Bai that he would do it himself. Before he could even blink his eyes, the boy went to fetch the handkerchief. As soon as the handkerchief slipped out of Bai's hands, Su immediately calculated the situation and quickly rushed after the purple handkerchief. Pushing off the ground, Su caught the handkerchief in a powerful leap. This saved him from a fatal fall to the ground. After landing with the handkerchief in his hand, Su turned around and walked towards Lan. He was glad that he had done a good deed and saved the handkerchief for the young man. But at the same time, he was a little ashamed of both his behavior and his thoughts towards this effeminate young man. Su ran up to Bai, happily waving his hand in which the handkerchief was clasped, and informed Lan that the handkerchief was fine. Dying of shame, Su approached Lan and held out his hand with the handkerchief, returning the item to its owner. Su felt like falling under the ground. Lan smiled politely and thanked Mr. Su fervently for his courtesy. The young man reached out his hand for his handkerchief, but instead of simply taking the handkerchief from the young man's hands, Lan casually touched his fingers to Mr. Su's hand, as if by accident. Su was sweating even more. When he realized that their hands were touching, he jumped back in surprise and dropped the handkerchief. Lan said fearfully. The handkerchief drifted away again. Su turned around and frowned at the handkerchief circling in a gust of wind and slowly sinking to the ground. Bai folded his hands in front of him pleadingly and looked at Su tenderly. He asked the young man to help him and bring him the handkerchief that had been carried away by the wind. Su automatically rushed out of his seat. He was happy to favor the young man and assured that it wouldn't be a problem. He would bring it over in a flash. Suddenly, an unpleasant thought crossed Su's mind. He frowned and asked himself what he was doing now, but it was too late to retreat. Su was sweating even more. He couldn't understand what was happening to him right now. Besides the fact that what was happening wasn't quite right, Su also felt joyful about it all. The young man walked over to the handkerchief and stood over it, frowning. He caught himself thinking that he even wanted to earn Lan's gratitude. Right now, two natures were fighting within him. Su's first nature took the second one by the collar, shook him, and urged him to pull himself together. Su reproached himself that he should not have embarrassed himself like that. Arguing with himself, Su came to the conclusion that this man was too scary, and one should adamantly reject his signs of attention. That thought sobered his mind, and Su happily told himself that he did. He should just refuse Lan. Meanwhile, Su still bent down to the ground for his handkerchief. He was on his knees, handkerchief in hand, and couldn't understand why he was allowing himself to be so easily manipulated by an effeminate young man. Bai had been standing behind Su's back the whole time, waiting obediently for him to bring him the dropped item. Lan asked Mr. Su what had happened to him. He asked why Su had his hands so absorbed in someone else's handkerchief and wasn't going to let go. Lan remarked that it looked very cute. Su turned around and looked at Bai. He felt ashamed of his actions. Su was drenched in sweat, and yet he couldn't help himself. Finally, he made the only right decision and started to flee. Lan shouted in his wake that Su still had his handkerchief in his hand. Lan was very pleased with himself and his actions. He smiled slyly to himself as he looked at the fleeing Su. After all, his sudden escape meant that Su would return to the training ground not soon. In this way, Lan helped the master avoid unwanted problems. Meanwhile, at the Temple of Heavenly Will, Tao Er's training continued. Master stated that she should focus on the 36 small circles of qi circulation. Yan assured that this method would allow the girl to advance to one of the most important steps. Tao sat in front of him with her head tilted. She was very ashamed of her appearance. The mentor reminded the girl that he had just told her about the principle of the training method, and he wanted to know if Tao Er had memorized everything. The girl didn't care. Her face was burning, and she couldn't make a sound out of embarrassment. Tao was very disturbed by the abbot's behavior. She remembered with shame that her mentor had touched her thighs, gently adjusting her stockings, and now no one would be able to take her as a wife. Yan understood her mood perfectly and smirked, closing his eyes in pleasure. He thought that his foolish student had nothing to be ashamed of. He remembered that he had only helped the girl to adjust her stockings, on which the creases had formed. It was simply impossible to avoid their touch in this process. Justifying his actions, Yan told himself that as a kindred spirit, there was no way in his life he would have allowed himself to think of anything disgusting. After all, he had merely smoothed the folds of her stockings in a friendly manner, and he saw nothing objectionable here. making a serious expression on her face. Yan reminded her of one famous expression that spoke of a mentor becoming a father for life. Embarrassed, Tao admitted that she had heard that expression more than once. Her mentor involuntarily made her blush, and Tao looked forward to the end of the training session. Master informed Tao that they were one family from today, so there was no need to get caught up in the many rules and unnecessary formalities. Yan was glad that Tao finally understood him. He asked Lin and Junhen to step forward and give their sister a visual demonstration. The master could finally take a break. He had been in too much of a hurry and had almost scared the girl away. He could only hope that everything would work itself out in time. Mo Junhen's sword slammed into the concrete base of the training ground with a clang. This noise drew everyone's attention and distracted Tao slightly. Yu Ling and Mo Junhen reported combat readiness in one voice. They were ready to train at any minute. Mentor Yan and Tao moved farther away to the steps going up to the shrine. Lin and Junhen took their place on the platform. They adopted battle stances, exposing their blades. Junhen smirked and said that he hadn't tested the younger disciple's abilities in a long time. Yuling warned his older brother that he should be more careful. Junhen didn't reply anything to Lin and immediately soared into the air, intending to crush his opponent from on high. Yuling immediately followed the example of his older brother disciple and flew up from his seat towards Mo Junheng. The mentor stood smiling and watched the battle of his disciples hovering in the air. Tao stood there with her mouth hanging open. Yu Ling rushed towards his elder brother like a comet and swung his sword at him. He was confident that he would defeat him in this aerial duel. Mo Junhen flew towards his opponent and swung his foot in a leap. On the fly, Mo began to pull out his sword from behind his back, anticipating a quick victory. Tao, who was blushing, looked at the duelists, and suddenly a vague hunch crossed her mind. The girl called out to the guys that their faces looked very familiar, and it was quite likely that they had met Tao before. Looking at them more closely, the girl was convinced that this was the case. Now she remembered these young men. Tao told the senior disciple that he was very much like the gentleman who had once saved her from being chased. As for the third student, Tao recalled that his build seemed quite familiar to her as well. The girl stood and pointed a finger at each of them. Master Yan and his disciples dejectedly lowered their heads. They were not entirely happy about the fact that Tao had recognized and exposed everyone. Tao kept looking at the third disciple thoughtfully. She tried to remember where she could have seen him. This thought kept bothering her. She recalled the events that had happened 6 months ago, and concluded that this man was very similar to the man who had attacked her. Master Yan laughed pretentiously and said that it was just her fantasy. They just looked like those people, and it couldn't have happened. The duel stopped. Yan explained to Tao that these two had not left Huanhai for 30 years. Therefore, there was absolutely no way she could have seen them before. Junhan and Yu Ling immediately realized the consequences and ran away. Tao looked at the young people in surprise and asked her mentor about the reason for their escape. Master Yan turned pale. His disciples had left him to deal with the girl's suspicions, and left him to deal with his own. The mentor said in a stern voice that it was class time and there was no need to be distracted by other things. Tao fell on her knees at the appointed place and agreed with him. In a cautionary tone, Yan demanded to study the technique thoroughly. Tao should start from the very basics and then continue to go deeper. Master Yan was out of his mind. He had somehow miraculously escaped this time as well, but Tao still nearly caught him in a lie. This was getting dangerous. Yan regretfully thought that the danger was still not completely over, and the disciple he had gotten with such difficulty could easily walk away from him. The master was happy to think that the girl was still too naive and believed everything, and when everything was over, he would teach her the wisdom of life. He gazed greedily at the girl's lovely figure, and promised that he would do it so that she could not be fooled by any scoundrel. Suddenly, the master's eyes opened wide. He saw something and realized that he hadn't made a mistake in choosing the girl to be his apprentice. Tao was sitting on her knees, meditating with her eyes closed. At some point, a powerful ice pillar appeared behind her. The girl continued to sit there serenely. Master Yan looked very satisfied. Of course he was, because he had obtained a very capable disciple. This was what was expected of a child chosen by the heavenly Tao. With only her innate talents, she is already able to interact with the powers of Poe's 3 animal souls, and her talent is quite good, even by the master's own standards. Tao sat in front of her mentor with her eyes closed and thought lovingly that Yan was destined for her by fate itself. She vowed to herself that she would officially honor Yan as her master starting today. Tao remembered the large forest with large trees that they passed through on their way to the Temple of Heaven's Will and all the suspicious moments. Despite the incomprehensible, sometimes quite strange behavior of her fellow students, the girl would very much like to get along with all of them in the future. Tao remembered those 2 subjects, Lin and Junhen. They were acting very suspiciously, and the girl was sure that they had made that play. However, one had to keep in mind the most important thing, which was the goal to be achieved. Master Yan could help her with that. Under his guidance, the girl practiced with the sword and realized that she too needed to try hard on the path to her perfection. Several years had passed since that very first day of Tao Er's spiritual development training. Another sunny day had come. Strong gusts of wind fluttered the white sheets hung on a clothesline on the patio. Tao Er was very hard to manage on her own. The girl was already tired, and now she had to work hard on herself. She reproached herself that she had been leading an independent life here for quite some time, but even now she could not wash her own clothes by herself. Tao Er resented her older brother's behavior as well. He had always helped her, but now he just walked away, and she didn't know how to use the soap pods of the Gladikia. Mentor Yan stood at the girl's back and listened to her dissatisfaction. He came up to her and said that he saw Tao Er doing laundry. The girl was startled and dropped everything into the basin. She turned around and saw that it was indeed Yan. The girl was surprised and asked what the purpose of his visit was. The mentor announced that he had come to check on how his capable student was coping with independent living. Tao Er tried to cover her laundry. She begged him not to look and asked why the master was laughing at her, for any success was out of the question. The girl explained that she'd had servants help her with the laundry before, and she was just a little inexperienced at it, that's all. Yan was very surprised. His eyes lit up with a sly fire. The master realized that he had a chance to win the girl back to his side. He immediately threw off his jacket right on the floor. The mentor explained that in addition to spiritual development, he could teach the girl household skills. Smiling, Yan rolled up his sleeves. Tao Er was ready to fall ashamed and asked in surprise if it was okay to do that. The master assured that there is no problem with it. He would show how it was all done, and so he asked the girl to watch carefully and memorize. Yan stuck his hands into the basin of laundry and realized it was a girl's clothes. He was very happy that he could touch the clothes of an unmarried young girl after many years. Yan began to explain to the girl that she should not rub the soap pods on her clothes at once. You should rinse the clothes first and then use the pods. After all, she had just taken off her underwear and was left in one dress and stockings. The girl was very worried and embarrassed. Tao Er was very embarrassed. Her face was burning. She wanted to scream loudly or make it so that no one would remember. She remembered with horror that all her other underwear was also in the basin, and covered her eyes with her hands in shame. Yan pretended not to notice and asked if she remembered everything. Mentor grabbed her underwear that was lying near the basin of laundry and as if casually remarked that it was quite hot today. Yan brought an element of her clothes to his cheek and wiped his face with sweat. The girl was angry and couldn't say a word out of anger. Her mentor winked at her, asked what was wrong, and carelessly took her underwear by the corner. Tao was ready to fall to the ground, tears welling up on her face. Carelessly tossing her underwear aside, Yan explained to the girl in a calm voice that soap alone was not enough here. Tao blushed even more. The girl had a faint hope that the mentor hadn't noticed anything and had mistaken the girl's underwear for rags. Yan nonchalantly told her that the next thing to do was to rub the clothes repeatedly. Tao thought that the master didn't understand and had taken the clothes by mistake. In that case, things could still be fixed. Tao Er watched her mentor for a while. He seemed to be engrossed in the laundry and didn't see anything around him. Then the girl furtively walked around the side of him and crouched down beside her underwear, which the master had tossed aside. Yan paid no attention to Tao, and the girl grabbed her underwear. She hid it behind her back and decided that she couldn't let the master know about this incident. She was very uncomfortable. In addition, the girl was worried about how her mentor could remain so calm. Yan winked at Tao Er. The girl realized that it was now that he was rubbing soap on her most intimate elements of clothing, and flushed like a boiled cancer again. She couldn't believe she was the only girl who cared about such matters. Tao couldn't get rid of her crimson complexion. Yan was making her blush. Looking at her mentor's serene face, the girl realized, to her deepest regret, that she was the only one bothered by the question. But she was mistaken. Yan was perfectly calm on the outside for appearance's sake, but inside, he was jubilant that he was able to get to the most intimate element of the garment. After finishing the laundry, Yan and Tao Er worked together to hang it to dry on the clothesline. Yan said that after working hard, the mood would immediately lift. Tao Er was ready to die of shame. She stared at the ground and could not look at the master. It seemed to her that no one would take her as a wife after that. As if remembering something, Yan said that Tao Er didn't seem to have any business right now. So he asked her to come into his master's spacious room for a while. Tao Er's eyes started to water and she became even more shy. She couldn't understand what exactly the mentor meant. The obscene suggestion came to her mind at once, and now her face was burning with shame. She asked the master in a low voice why she was going to his office. The sun was shining brightly that day. The unusual climate of this place made it possible to observe various atmospheric phenomena with the naked eye. Master Yan and Tao Er were walking through the central plaza right in the center of the courtyard. The girl couldn't understand what the proposal was. The girl followed her mentor without complaint, but she was very nervous. She was worried about the fact that the master had called her to his room out of the blue. Tao Er assumed that Yan would ask her to be his girlfriend. She imagined herself in her mentor's arms on a bed of roses. It was quite obvious to the girl because Master Yan had allowed himself to do things of not quite moral origin towards her. She shook her head furiously, blushing as if to dismiss the thought as wrong. Tao convinced herself it wasn't that at all. After all, Yan is her mentor, and this is most likely a matter related to her training and continued spiritual perfection. Master Yan stood with his back to the girl and looked thoughtfully out the round window. Tao Er thought again that this love could be mutual. The girl blushed again. She was tentative and shy, stomping around in one place. She had not told her mentor why she had come here yet. The master sat down on the couch near the window and patted the seat beside him, motioning for Tao Er to take the seat next to him. The girl was a little startled. An indignant Tao shouted that there was no way she could do that. After all, people usually do such things only after marriage. The girl continued to protest, and the mentor sat there, unable to understand why Tao Er was furious with him. He turned pale and silently waited for the girl to calm down. Master Yan confusedly asked what Tao Er meant now. The mentor didn't intend to cause her any harm, he only wanted to draw a portrait of her. The master's confession made the girl blush. She felt ashamed of her suspicion of him. Tao Er tried not to look her mentor in the eye. To her regret, the girl realized that the master had no intention of offering her anything obscene. He only wanted to paint her portrait. To justify herself, Tao Er immediately became indignant and said that the portrait was also wrong. Yan ran around the room around her, picking up a suitable pose. The girl had already calmed down a bit and was trying to stand still in one place and not fidget. Suddenly she saw something interesting. Right in front of Tao Er, there was a wall gallery of paintings behind the master's back, and the girl on one of them was very similar to Tao herself. The girl immediately rushed to the gallery. She was curious to see what else was depicted there. Yan put the unfinished portrait aside in bewilderment. The first picture showed a napping chick in a nest. One wing was bandaged. Tao said that the chick was very cute. The girl marveled at the striking authenticity and asked if the work was his. The master continued to draw Tao Er from the back and smiled. He said that he wanted to introduce the girl to her older sister co-student. Tao Er was surprised. She couldn't believe that this bird could be her older sister. Yan took out some drawings and showed one of them. He explained that the bird had been injured and had fallen into the grounds of the Temple of Heavenly Will. Showing another picture of a girl in a tree, the preceptor said that this was her appearance in human form. Her name is Yang Yan. They stood in front of the gallery, and Yan told her that the girl was indeed older than Tao Er. They were like a family, and Yan relied on her mentor for a lot of things. At this point, the master's face changed and became very sad. He said that he was very sorry that it had happened like this. Tao Er looked at him in surprise and asked why he felt sorry for that girl. Mentor Yan was a master of understatement. Yan said sadly, "One day someone leaves you, and only then do you realize how happy those days were." Tao Er suddenly realized what the master meant. The girl must have died, and that was why the master spoke about her with such sadness, as if he was grieving for her. She hesitantly assumed that the girl had already gone to the world of immortals. Tao grabbed the master's hand and apologized for asking about it. Yan smiled and hurriedly explained that Tao had misunderstood him. Yan had traveled to a distant land and was not around now. The girl was glad to see this ending to the story. She continued to hold her mentor's hand in her palms. She was genuinely glad that her big sister was okay. When the emotion subsided a little, the girl was surprised to realize that she was holding her mentor's hand in her own. It was unacceptable to her. Her face immediately took on a crimson hue. Tao Er was very ashamed of her emotional behavior. She frowned and looked at the floor, staring at the ceiling to avoid facing the master's gaze. Tao stammered and exclaimed that she was apologizing. Yan smiled and said he didn't see anything wrong. He added that they would meet again in the future. And now his heart is filled with joy at the mere memory of their life together. The girl turned her attention to the next picture with the indignant girl and asked if Master and Yan's relationship was really so marvelous. The mentor smirked and told her that it couldn't have been any other way. After all, Yan trusted Master to the fullest extent. Mentor Yan remembered asking him to raise Yan's already short dress a little higher. He was telling the girl that he would draw a masterpiece, and there was no need to be embarrassed. Yan said that he didn't want to let the girl go when she decided to leave him. In fact, he grabbed Yan's legs and begged her to stay, but she called him a dirty pervert. Master Yan assured Tao Er that he was sad to the point of tears, The girl herself was ready to cry at such a touching story. Now she understood what family meant. Tao was surprised to see that the master was still standing by the gallery, stroking the painting as if trying to breathe life into it. The mentor's thoughts were far away from here. He lamented that he hadn't been able to keep Yan with him. He regretfully thought back to the day they had met for the first time. Their separation had been predetermined beforehand. The master remembered standing on a high cliff and seeing Yan soaring into the sky like a fiery phoenix. He waved goodbye to her. Even the sky itself seemed to have an ominous red-yellow devilish hue, as if mocking the master. Yan remembered his disciple and recalled his words that one day, Yan would spread his majestic wings and ignite a bright flame that would never be extinguished. Then the girl opened one eye and looked at him incredulously. The master added that Yan would then go to the free heights. He closed his eyes and said sadly, all he had to do was protect the temple of heavenly will and watch Yan withdraw far, far away. The master was standing on the edge of a high cliff, and the girl flew up to him, turning into a giant fire phoenix. They looked at each other for a while, and now he was looking at the painting as a memory. The master wanted to believe that Yan was now happily floating in the air in a completely different land. Tao felt that the mentor was actually very sad. She realized that the relationship between the master and her elder sister was deeper than she had thought. The girl looked at her mentor and called out to him excitedly. The master meant much more to her now than a spiritual advisor. Tao felt it. She exclaimed that from now on, Tao wanted to always stay by master's side. The girl could only hope that the master would not reject her. Mentor Yan looked at her perplexedly. He was trying to figure out what caused Tao's mood to change so suddenly. After thinking about the situation for a bit and calculating the possible benefits, Yan smirked contentedly. Yan's portraits played into his hands. The master approached Tao and gently, in a fatherly manner, stroked the girl's head. She looked at the teacher fearfully. The mentor looked Tao in the eyes, making eye contact. He realized that he could not miss this chance. Master Yan smiled and said that they seemed to have sorted out the Yan portraits, so it was time for them to continue with the portrait of Tao. The girl had not expected such a quick transition and became embarrassed again. Her indignant cry could be heard even in the courtyard. 3 more days had passed since the visit to the portrait gallery. It was another warm summer day. The sky was almost cloudless. Tao jumped over the steps, walking down quickly. Mentor Yan followed a few steps behind. Bai Lan kept a respectful distance and closed the procession. The girl asked the master why they had only gone to the divine gorge for the potions, without the eldest and third apprentice. Master Yan blanched. He remembered well that time on the training ground. The girl had been a little suspicious. Tao guessed even then that they were playing their roles. In the event that Junhen and Lin were near her, she would easily recognize them, and then there would be trouble. The master said that Junhen had recently imbibed the art of sword-wielding, so he would become a hermit for a while. As for Yuling, the mentor didn't want to embarrass his housemate disciple. Lin himself was now sitting in a corner, counting ants out of boredom. Tao perplexedly suggested that it might be because Yuling had once been grabbed and squeezed out all the juices. She even asked her older brother the meaning of those words. Master said that on that day, Yuling had gotten a lot of publicity. Unfortunately, his character had changed a lot after the incident. Mentor Yan enviously said that he actually didn't feel that bad, and the psychological trauma on this background didn't look that big. Bai Lan intervened and told the master that he didn't know anything at all. He explained that there was no need for the young fairies of the 9 heavens to engage in pair cultivation. Lan added that this method is only resorted to by female members of the current who are more than 100 years old and cannot improve further for some reason. Master Yan now saw everything in a different light. He imagined the ancient witch mocking the young man and reproaching him for not trying hard enough. The mentor turned pale. He understood why Yuling didn't want to say a word about those times. Tao couldn't hold back a smile and smirked embarrassedly. The master didn't understand everything about the situation. He asked Bai how Lin managed to escape from the evil sorcerer's environment at all. He immediately pictured little tiny Yuling running away from the evil witch who loomed over him like Gulliver over the Lilliputians. Lan said that the details were unknown. But on the day of Yuling's escape, the head of the 9 heavens fairy current, for an unknown reason, clashed with her daughter, and a commotion ensued. Bai said that the mother scolded her daughter, calling her a slutty wretch, and the daughter berated her mother for her lack of shame. However, Lan said that it could have been the other way around. Master Yan took his head and said that by fate, Yulin had not only gotten into a mess, but had also witnessed a family drama over morals on top of that. With these words, the mentor managed to defuse the situation. Bai Lan and Tao couldn't help but laugh out loud. Master Yan jokingly reprimanded the girl. He sternly rebuked Tao for dabbling, and said that it was wrong to make fun of a fellow student. The 3 of them walked for quite a long time like that, and spent the time on the way with various stories from the past and jokes. By evening, the travelers reached the town of Min. It was very dangerous to continue at night, so Master Yan suggested that they stay and spend the night in the city. Soon they were walking through the evening square of the city, looking at the merchandise. Tao Er saw her favorite candied fruits on a stick and exclaimed that Tanhulu was a great treat for her. The vendor assured her that his product was of the best quality. He invited the girl to look at more, and Tao excitedly rushed to look at a variety of hairpins and combs. There were perfumes here too. Bai Lan told his mentor that he would go and look for an inn. It would be necessary to book rooms in advance. They both looked at the enthusiastic Tao Er. Lan suggested that the master take a stroll through the evening city of Mingyi in the meantime. The mentor was grateful to Lan. This young man immediately understood the atmosphere and casually left him alone with his disciple, thus giving them a date. Master Yan closed his eyes in pleasure. This was just what he needed. The mentor smirked contentedly. It was as if the atmosphere was just right for a stroll. After waiting for Lan to leave, the master called out to Tao Er. She had just sat down at the next counter and was looking at various delicious things. Yan served the girl a portion of tanghulu and said that she was obviously hungry, since he had been looking at that tray so carefully. Tao Er thanked the master fervently. The mentor gave her a hand and asked the girl to stay close to him so as not to get lost. He asked her to stay close to him so that she wouldn't get lost. The girl was instantly embarrassed and began to argue with herself. She was proving to herself that only lovers hold hands, and she shouldn't do it. Her second personality convinced the first that there was nothing wrong if the master asked for it. In this case, principles could be disregarded. They were one family. The second side overcame the first, and the girl hesitantly extended her hand to her mentor. In order not to scare Tao Er away, Yan waited patiently and gently took her hand. The two strolled leisurely through the plaza along the vendors' rows, holding hands. Tao Er was happily eating her candied fruit on a sprig. They were very tasty, and the girl sucked them with pleasure because she had not eaten such a delicacy from her childhood for 100 years. The tanghulu were very sweet, and Tao Er secreted saliva copiously, which remained on the pointed peg and dripped off it onto the ground. It was as if the girl didn't notice it, and embarrassedly suggested to her mentor that she join in and taste the treat as well. Yan also blushed a little and said that he didn't need to beg for a long time since the girl insisted, and Tao Er handed him a tanghula. At this moment, an enthusiastic cheer was heard from outside. Some young man was quite surprised by the coincidence that Lady Su was here. Tao Er looked at the young man more closely. She started to remember and assumed that young Master Luo was standing in front of her. The young man was not alone. He was leading a group of people, all wearing purple outfits. The young man confirmed that his name was indeed Luo Qingping and they had seen each other before she left. Luo smiled, pressed his hand to his chest, and declared that now they had suddenly met again. The young man saw it as a sign of fate. Tao Er smiled and said that it was indeed a funny coincidence. The girl stated that they still had things to do, so they had to go. Luo Qingping suddenly stopped the girl. The young man asked her to take her time. He believed that the sign of fate implied walking together since they had met here. Luo couldn't tear his greedy gaze away from Tao Er's wide neckline, which revealed her breasts rather than hiding them. Qingping lustfully said that the market of Mingyi City wasn't that big, but they could still find quite a few interesting places here. The girl was indignant and told Qingping that she and her companions still had a lot of things that needed to be done. Luo Qingping seemed to have only now noticed that the girl in the square was not alone. He shifted his gaze to his opponent. Luo apologized for his bad manners and sneered that because of the young man's insignificance, he didn't notice him at all. Therefore, Qingping asks to leave them alone. The girl was indignant and shouted to Luo that he had no idea who it was. Master Yan stopped her with a gesture. He didn't need the scandal. He smiled and said that he was walking here with his student. Yan noticed that their meeting with Mr. Luo was indeed not accidental, but predestined by the heavens. Luo Qingping was surprised and assumed that the very abbot of the Temple of Heaven's Will was standing in front of him. He was curious to see him in person. Yan said that it is like this. He is the mentor of Tao Er. Luo Qingping couldn't stand it and laughed loudly. He couldn't help himself after all. This wasn't the kind of encounter he had expected. Luo's entire group started teasing Tao in every way possible. This person didn't even look like a teacher. Neither Tao Er nor Yan reacted to the provocations. Luo Qingping walked closer to the master, almost in close proximity, and gazed intently into his face. He stated that Yan seemed suspicious to him. He was full of hidden secret intentions. The mentor only smiled in response to his angry outbursts, and Luo blurted out that the master was definitely hatching some bad plans. Master Yan continued to hold on. He knew that he couldn't afford to interrupt his date with the beautiful Tao Er just because of a couple of annoying gnats. The mentor discreetly glanced in the girl's direction. He mentally begged her not to pay any attention to the group of envious fools. Qingping continued to persuade the girl. He assured her that Yan was just fooling her, but at the same time, Luo himself guaranteed Tao personalized training at the Luoqing school. Tao indignantly told Luo that every disciple, even after completing their training, becomes them forever, so she asked them not to be disturbed. Master Yan paternally placed his hand on her head. He smirked and covered his eyes in pleasure. He knew that this sentence alone was already enough. Tao Er was on his side. The mentor smiled proudly and stared at Luo Qingping with a victorious gaze. The battle had been lost, and he had to retreat. Master Yan slyly opened one eye and snidely asked Luo Qingping if Luo Qingping had any other questions for him. But Luo felt far superior to his opponent, so he wasn't going to give in to him at all. He turned pale and said that Yan must have deigned to make a joke. His mentor replied to him that Qingping looked like a human but acted like a dog, and he wasn't going to listen to that. Moreover, Luo only exacerbated their conflict. Qingping was completely enraged. He couldn't say anything out of anger and only poked and prodded helplessly and tried to threaten the master. The mentor smirked and said that Qingping simply couldn't accept that she had such a soulful relationship with her master. Luo Qingping realized his blunder too late and exclaimed that it wasn't like that at all, and they had just misunderstood him. That was enough for Tao, and she turned away proudly. Yan admonished, stating that he was Tao Er's mentor. In status, it was equal to his elders. Even more so, his disrespectful behavior equated to an insult. Master Yan friendly agreed to give Luo one last chance. If Qingping left through the dog loophole in the city gate, he wouldn't make any claims. This infuriated the young man, and he declared that he was the eldest son of the master of the Luoqing school. No one dared to insult him. The members of his group didn't seem to mind swinging their fists. Luo Qingping saw something he really didn't like. He turned pale with anger and started spitting saliva. Yan didn't react to anything at all. He only placed his palm on the embarrassed girl's head and declared that he was Tao Er's mentor. He turned to the girl, winked cheerfully at her, and said that the master was very pleased with the honor of being mentored by the beautiful Tao Er. The girl nodded happily. She said in response, Tao Er was even more excited to be Grandmaster Yan's disciple. Luo Qingping couldn't stand it. He was beyond angry. Suddenly, Mentor Yan saw someone new, and he turned his attention to the man. The man approached Qingping's group. That man was also wearing purple clothes. He laughed and said that Abbot Z had a pretty good tongue. He was satisfied. The man took off his hood and introduced himself as Feng Shanfeng, the patron of Luoqing School. He suggested that they become friends since they had met today. Feng said he still does not know the location of the so-called Temple of Heavenly Will and its size. The number of the mentor's disciples also remains a mystery. Tao Er hid behind the master's back and looked out fearfully from there. He joked that he didn't have many students. 1, 2, and a few. Shanfeng assured him that they had at least 1,000 ascetics and hundreds of thousands of servants from the common people who worshipped them. The mentor was very surprised by such an imposing figure. Tao Er was even more surprised. Hundreds of thousands of acolytes simply did not invest in her imagination. Feng assured the girl that those ordinary people lived in peace and tranquility under the protection of their warriors. So it was perfectly normal to charge them tribute. The girl was indignant. After all, the imperial court already imposes exorbitant taxes on its people, which not everyone manages to pay. Tao Er exclaimed that after all that, it was simply not nice or fair to demand any more offerings from those people. Feng explained to the girl that without the protection of his men, many different troubles could happen to their belongings, which is why they accept gifts from peasants. Tao shouted that it was their school's fault that people went to such lengths. She was sure that the peasants were just forced. The girl shouted that Feng was a shameless person. Shanfan exclaimed that she just didn't understand anything. To maintain a current of several thousand people, it wasn't enough for them to just hunt through the forests and grow vegetables. The girl ran out of arguments and couldn't say a word out of anger. The mentor told Tao Er that it was not worth bickering with cowardly people. He would settle the matter himself. Yan was angry with himself. To think that he had wasted so much time on this horde of insects. Even a few tens of thousands of years hadn't taught him anything. Considering they had nearly brought his precious student to tears, it was time to put a bold end to this conversation and teach them a little lesson. At the same moment, someone tugged at his clothes from behind. He heard someone call him Master. Master Yan turned around and saw Bai Lan. He had a thin veil of white light cloth over his face. It made him look more like a girl. Bai Lan imperiously hooked his elbow on the master's elbow and dragged him away. He said that he and his apprentice had had enough of loitering around the city without doing anything. With his other hand, he grabbed Tao Er and explained that they should return to the inn and rest as soon as possible. Bai said that they would go to the Divine Gorge tomorrow as it was too late today. Luo Qingping couldn't stand it and shouted after the trio to stop immediately. He was already ready to catch up with them. Suddenly, he felt someone put their hand heavily on his shoulder. Master Luoqin's son turned around unhappily. As it turned out, it was Feng. He explained to the young man that he shouldn't worry so much about nothing. The young man looked at his mentor with a puzzled look. Shanfen clarified that he should have listened better, for those three had said they would go to Divine Gorge tomorrow. Divine Gorge was a narrowing mountain canyon with a rather narrow stream running below it. If you wanted to, you could jump over it. Bailan and Tao Er were hunting for a strange creature with human legs and the body of a fish. The creature had a full tail and fins, and Tao wasn't sure if it could be eaten. But in the evening, the girl quickly changed her mind. The captured creature was slowly roasting on a spit in its own juice. When the dish was served, Tao Er drooled at the fragrant smell of the food. The girl exclaimed that the dish smelled delicious. The girl was fascinated by Bai's cooking skills and asked if she could learn to cook as good. Yan thought that the local wildlife was very good. Master Yan smiled and thought that Lan's spatial bag really did contain anything. He redefined the concept of surviving by any means necessary. Suddenly, the mentor discovered something not quite right for their setting. He frowned and took a closer look. Yan couldn't believe his eyes. Despite his categorical prohibition, Bailan had still taken a few sets of women's clothes with him on the hike. Bailan was just doing the cooking at this moment and didn't see anything. Tao Er stood nearby and questioned him. Yan asked Bai to come over to him. Master Yan unceremoniously turned Lan's female clothes out of the spatial bag. Bai sat on his lap and obediently bowed his head. The mentor was out of his mind. Bai had rarely seen him so angry. Yan shouted that Lan shouldn't have women's clothes, and he had warned the young man about that when he had taken him on the trek. Bailan immediately began to justify that there was nothing wrong with that. After all, he had just brought these clothes with him, but he had no intention of wearing them at all. The mentor folded all these women's clothes into one bundle and handed them to Bai. He wanted the disciple to throw them away himself. Lan looked at him with a pleading look. He cursed himself for not listening to the master. He asked for permission to keep at least 1 or 2 sets of clothes. Lan asked for permission to keep at least 1 or 2 sets of clothes. But the mentor was relentless. He frowned at his disciple, and Bailan realized that he wouldn't get away with persuasion. At the same moment, Master Yan simply turned around and threw the bundle of Bai's female clothes away. Lan helplessly stared back at him. The mentor threatened to flog him right in front of his fellow sister if such a thing happened again, and Bailan dejectedly bowed to him. The master and his apprentice came to the fire where Tao Er was working. She wanted to ask her mentor what they were doing, but her mouth was full of food, so she couldn't make any sense out of it. Yan said that nothing special had happened. It was time for them to move on their way. Tao exclaimed that they hadn't eaten anything, and everything was so delicious. In fact, there was nothing to eat anymore. Soon they continued on their way through the Divine Gorge. The gorge became deeper and deeper, and Mentor Yan said that this was the abyss of the Divine Gorge. The gorge ended in a high cliff. In several places, streams of mountain water were noisily running down. There was absolutely nothing to be seen below. To get a better look around, Tao Er squatted down by the cliff. She said with admiration that this pit was very big. Yan looked closely at the terrain. Suddenly he noticed a large flower growing straight out of the rock. In spite of the strong flow of water, the bright red flower held firmly to its stem. Master Yan was satisfied. They had found what they came here for. The mentor exclaimed happily that they had found a flower of water and fire. The flower was indeed like a flame. Bailan called Bailan over to him and silently pointed to a flower blazing with fire in the mountain waters. The young man immediately rushed to carry out the order. Bailan ran as fast as he could. He was ashamed of himself for disobeying instructions. The young man raced towards the cliff, leaving only a puff of dust behind him. At the very last moment, Bailan pushed off and soared into the air, leaving behind the surprised and frightened Tao Er. The mentor watched calmly. Bailan clearly calculated his jump and spun down onto the mountain stream, landing carefully near the flower itself so as not to damage it. The young man leaned over to the fiery flower and gently pulled its stem. He had to pick it correctly, or there would be no new ones. Bailan proudly displayed his flower, raising it upwards. Tao Er expressed her delight by raising both her hands up. Only Mentor Yan did not react. He stood still as he did. The master told Bai to get up quickly, for they were waiting for him. He couldn't forgive Lan Yu's prank with women's clothes. Suddenly a voice was heard from behind. Luo Qingping curtly said hello to Tao Er. Naturally, he was not by himself, and had brought the fighters in the Divine Gorge with him. Lo said happily that they had met again. He was already anticipating the pleasure, and was ready to teach his teacher a little lesson. Tao Er opened her eyes wide with fear. This old acquaintance frightened her very much. The mentor, on the other hand, didn't seem surprised in the least. You could tell by the look on his face that he was even glad to have this meeting far away from the city, where no one would save the hooligans. Bailan winked cheerfully at his master. He knew that this master's smirk wouldn't do any good for the uninvited guests. Luo Qingping was glad that he had managed to catch the girl and her companions off guard. He was advancing on the travelers with 5 of his fighters. Bailan had just jumped out of the gorge instead of the flower and was watching them. He even felt a little sorry for the impudent men who didn't realize who they were messing with. Qingping stepped forward. Smiling excitedly, he declared that here they were, meeting again. The superiority was on his side, and Luo knew it. Master Yan smirked back and said with surprise that it was just that guy whose name he couldn't even recall due to his inconspicuousness. Mentor smiled and said that it was a very pleasant coincidence for him, and he was genuinely happy about their chance meeting. Luo asked him to stop braying and just give them the flower of water and fire if Yan understood what was really going on. Shanfan cut him short and wondered where his manners had gone. After all, there was absolutely no reason for the young man to make threats. Luo turned around in surprise. Shanfan told the master that they had come here for that flower. He offered to buy the flower of water and fire from the master. Shangfan added that he would put a fair price on that flower. He pretended to think about it and laughed merrily, saying that the flower was worth 3 of their lives. Tao Er was startled and hid behind her mentor's back. Master Yan smirked and said that such a price seemed really fair to him. The mentor frowned, his face immediately becoming serious. He stared at the smiling Shanfang, who was mentally celebrating his victory. The mentor's eyes lit up with an ominous red light. Snapping his fingers, Master Yan smirked and asked Shanfang if he was sure they could afford such a price. Shangfang scratched his beard with a smile. Luo shouted happily that Feng Shangfang's patron is a supreme master of the Luo King School, and he would swat them with 1 palm. Master Yan marveled that Shangfang was so good at martial arts. In his heart, he called him an idiot because he had specifically told him where he was going. The mentor smiled and asked Bai to give those unfortunate people the flower. Bai Lan happily agreed and encased the flower in a large protective sphere. He threw the orb towards Qingping as if it was something insignificant. As it flew out of his hands, the sphere gained speed. Feng Shangfang deftly caught it with his hand and smirked happily. They had the flower, and now the enemy could be dealt with. Luo understood this as well. He stood beside him and smiled. Tao Er was surprised. She couldn't understand how a master could just cowardly take the hard-won water and fire flower and give it away. Mentor Yan said that he had fulfilled his obligation and they had received the flower of water and fire. He asked if they could go. Luo Qingping smiled gloatingly and said that they never settled last time. Therefore, Master would not be able to leave here alive. Tao Er indignantly said that he promised to let them go if he got the flower. Luo smiled and stated that it was Mentor Feng who said that. It had nothing to do with him. Qingping smiled lustfully and said that he wanted to ask Lady Su again if she would like to be his personal disciple. His companions were clearly surprised by Tao's indecision. The girl exclaimed that Tao should be glad that Luo had his eye on her. Tao Er stood firmly and paid no attention to their remarks. Then the other students joined in the conversation. They said that Tao Er should have shown gratitude, but instead she's being trashy and insolent. Luo Qingping shouted that Tao Er simply has no choice and should not cling to her master. But if the girl agrees, Luo is willing to give her mentor's life. The girl heard the master's quiet voice beside her. He called her name in a steady voice. Tao turned around. She seemed embarrassed. Mentor Yan asked Tao if she now realized what those people were. The girl stood and looked at the master. Yan explained to her that even if she agreed, they still wouldn't keep their word. This group had planned to kill them from the beginning. They just wanted the flower of water and fire. The mentor asked Tao Er to remember firmly that not a word of cowardly people should be trusted. They are very treacherous. Now Tao Er understood everything. Yan had revealed the cruel truth to her. The girl exclaimed that it was clear to her and hugged her mentor's arm with both hands. Tao Er urged Luo Qingping to finally give up and give up on her. She reminded him that the one who becomes a mentor remains a master for the disciple for life. Blushing, Tao Er exclaimed that her master was a particularly important person to her, and so she would never leave him. Master Yan was ready to burst into tears as he listened to the pleasant speech about himself. He was very touched by the girl's feelings for him. Yan recognized that those types were very useful to him in amorous matters. However, he was getting tired of this comedy. He decided that it was time to teach these people who called themselves the Loxin School a lesson. But Luo Qingping wasn't going to deal with them right away. He had another trump card up his sleeve. Luo slyly called out to the master. He raised high above his head and showed everyone the ill-fated bundle of women's clothes. Luo asked his mentor if he recognized the bundle. Master Yan flinched in surprise. He had expected anything but that Bai's bag would end up in the possession of those crooks. Luo continued to press on and assumed that the veiled disciple's belongings were in there. When Luo unwrapped the bundle, he acted surprised and asked what the woman's clothes were doing there. Master Yan realized that the matter had taken a very unpleasant turn and turned pale. However, Bailan himself was smiling as if it didn't concern him. Qingping turned the roll over and asked Tao to take a look. It turned out that one man liked to wear womanizing clothes, and Luo was curious about which one it was. Luo couldn't calm down anymore and hyped them up further. He assumed that both Yan and Bai had an unconventional orientation. As soon as he had only said this phrase, the next offensive word stuck and remained unspoken. A powerful punch to the jaw stopped Qingping. Bailan gave him blow after blow without any apparent effort. It was as if he wasn't fighting, but rather amusing himself with his opponent. Bai hit Luo's bully with such force that he flew back to his fellow students. He lost several teeth along the way. Seeing this scene, his companions were frightened. They had not expected such a rebuff. Only now did the disciples of the Luo King School begin to see the Heavenly Will Temple's master as an opponent. Even Feng had to admit that the blow had been struck too quickly. He was beginning to realize that his opponent was not an easy one. Bailan fixed his hair and smirked. He liked the fact that his opponents were scared to death. Now it was possible to play on. Bai asked the opponents around him why they thought it was wrong for a man to wear such clothes. Bailan began to slowly pull off his clothes. Master Yan demanded that they stop. Tao was finally embarrassed and exclaimed that they were in the open air. Finding himself without clothes, Lan asked the people around him if it was so important that he was a man, as long as the clothes fit him. Luo and Feng looked at the naked young man confusedly. Bailan bent down to pick up the clothes and performed some manipulations on them. No one really understood what really happened. The next moment, Bailan was already standing dressed once again. This time he was wearing a white and blue robe mottled with blue flowers. Lan appeared in his new dress and stockings and asked if the world would collapse if he wore such clothes. Feng turned pale. He now recognized the young man. He shouted fearfully that Bai wasn't dead then and all those stories were true. At one time, Lan was attacked by 3 great masters. But at the last moment, the great sword spirit intervened and scattered his opponents like children. Luo Qingping angrily asked who it was. Shanfeng explained that this monster knew no barriers, and there was no evil he wouldn't do. Because of him, the cultivation world had changed. Ironically, Bai severed Feng's head just as he was swearing that for all of Lan's atrocities, he would not take his head off. The head of the mentor, with glazed eyes, drenched in blood, slowly rolled towards his students. After realizing what had happened, Luo Qingping shouted in a low voice. He jumped backwards and fell on his back in surprise and started to stagger backwards. Bai Lan touched his fingers, on which blood splattered to his face. He touched his bloody fingers to his lips. The young man smiled and seemed to give Qingping an air kiss with his fingers that had drops of blood on them. He gave the young man a hint of what was in store for him. Bai Lan handled the sword as easily and effortlessly as if he was dancing. After spinning around with the blade for a while, he spread his arms to different directions and stood with his back to his opponents. Lan was very satisfied. It had been a long time since he had felt this way. Nothing could give him as much satisfaction as the joy of battle. Meanwhile, Mentor Feng's severed head bounced off the ground and ended up at Loxin's feet. His companions were scared to death. The same thought was running through each of their minds. It was simply inconceivable that a supreme master had been struck down with a single blow. Without a moment's hesitation, all the disciples present, except Qingping, turned around and rushed to run away. Luo urged them to stop and promised a generous reward for Bai's head. No reward was needed for his daredevils, and they scattered in different directions. Lo begged to be saved. He was hurt that everyone had turned their backs on him, the master's eldest son. Bailan smirked. The situation was now entirely under his control. He would avenge all the wrong words and actions very soon. Bai whirled past the stunned Luo Qingping. Lan wasn't interested in this man right now. He was still cowardly and wouldn't go anywhere. Lan easily caught up with the fleeing enemies and picked his first target. As he rushed towards him, Bai interrupted his short life. Having finished his business, the young man turned around in the other direction, smiling happily. On the way, he flipped off another opponent. Soaring into the air, Bailan calmed down another particularly insolent opponent and silenced him for good. Even Master Yan himself couldn't look at it calmly. He turned Tao around to face him, hugged her, and asked her not to look, listen, or remember any of it. Luo Qingping yelled like a scalded man. He realized that sooner or later it would be his turn. Luo was overcome with panic and fear of death, and he cried and begged for forgiveness. But Bailan did not respond to his pleas and inexorably approached the young man. Qingping collapsed his head on the ground and remained like that. Bailan immediately stepped on his hand with the heel of his boot, and Qingping squealed like an uncut piglet. Without letting go of his hand, Bai said that now it was Luo Qingping's turn. The young man pleaded and shouted that Lan couldn't kill him so easily. Qingping began to threaten that if he died, the Luo King School would use all its strength to avenge him. The girl, the last of Qinping's group, also heard this conversation. She realized that she would not be spared either, and so she began to think feverishly about how she could get out of this dangerous situation. A rather interesting thought occurred to the girl. This option had many gaps, but there was nothing better in store anyway. The girl rightly thought she had better take her chances in this situation, and she ran at full speed towards Bai, pulling her sword from its sheath as she went. Bai Lan was just a bit busy and was teaching Qinping wisdom. One shouldn't insult people he didn't know for no reason. Seeing the rushing girl with a naked sword, Lan smiled. All these opponents had left the world too fast and boring. He was hoping to stretch himself a bit. Before she reached him, the girl swung her sword at the recent leader of her group. She hoped to buy her life with a sneak attack. The girl began cursing Luo and revealed that she had endured insults and offenses for 16 whole years. She added that Qinping was a morally depraved person. She assured that in the future, the younger sister would definitely thank the elder sister. For Lan's sake, she was ready to make any sacrifice and endure thousands of deaths. Bai looked at the girl carefully and said that Sis was apparently very serious. The girl was already beginning to believe in her salvation. Bai Lan informed her that it was not at all necessary to endure 1,000 deaths. His eyes lit up with the greedy, devilish fire of reprisal. The young man swung his sword and the girl's breathless body fell at his feet. Tao Er finally turned around and looked at the scene of carnage. Bai Lan stood with his back to them, holding a bloody sword, and told his last victim that one death was enough for him. When it was over, Master Yan called Lan over to him and said that he had always been curious about one question. Bai looked at his mentor in surprise. Yan said that he was burning with curiosity because he didn't know where Bai Lan usually hid his sword. Bai Lan smirked and said that the master had a very corrupted imagination and thought too badly of his disciple. A blush played on Bai's cheeks. He asked if Master Yan really wanted to know, and began to slowly lift the hem of his dress. Yan immediately turned away and demanded that the young man stop immediately. He assured Bai that he understood, and that was enough for him. In fact, when wearing men's clothing, a silver flexible sword was tied around his waist. Yan imagined a disciple wearing such attire. The mentor turned the sobbing girl's back to Lan and explained that normally this type was quite normal, but when dressed as a woman, he would break out into bad behavior. Lan told his mentor to call things by their proper names, since he had a pretty good figure. Tao was surprised. Yan became furious and asked Bai to shut up. Lan continued to give away the master's secrets, and revealed that the master often talks about how sad and lonely he is, but still doesn't want to get close to Lan. Tao Er intervened and asked Bai to change his clothes quickly so as not to anger his mentor. Tao Er intervened and asked Bai to change his clothes so as not to anger his mentor. Lan said that the master constantly pestered him with talk about how much he wanted a girl apprentice. He said that the mentor clearly longed to meet Tao Er all the time. Master Yan frowned unhappily. Staring at Tao Er's large cleavage, Bai Lan said that he was losing to the girl in this aspect as well. Tao took his hint and became embarrassed. Master Yan couldn't bear it anymore and rushed towards his disciple with a bullet. He grabbed him by the waist and pulled him away from Tao Er. Mentor pulled up the hem of Bayu's clothes, laid him on his lap, and began to spank his sternum in a fatherly, hearty manner. After the first blow, Bai Lan turned red with pain and resentment. He felt that he didn't deserve such a punishment, especially since he had just saved everyone from being massacred. Through tears, Bai Lan began to shout that his mentor was just a scoundrel and was treating him unfairly. Lan didn't deserve this. This made the master even angrier. He was unhappy that the guilty disciple was arguing with him and proving his point. Tao Er came running and wanted to intercede for him. Master Yan explained to the girl that there was something she didn't know. He told her that if Lan were to dress up as a woman, she would be in trouble. A couple decades ago, Bai Lan came down from the mountains. That day, the whole world turned into a bloodbath. No one could fight him, everyone died. Everything around was ablaze with red light, and brother was rushing at brother. The country had not seen such battles for a long time. It even came to the point that the main mentors of the three great currents gave their all to hound the young man. Tens of thousands of elite guardsmen and cavalrymen closed the ring and drove the young man into a stalemate. But they failed too. Luckily for him, Mo Junheng arrived in time and pulled him out of the deadly predicament. He picked Lan up and carried him upwards. The warriors were left with nothing. All they could do was shake the air with curses and empty threats. The stream with the fugitives was already far away. Master Yan said that otherwise those three old men would have captured the young man and used him for elixirs. Tao didn't understand everything he said, but she thought he was the best. Bai Lan changed into his usual attire and embarrassedly began to complain that his upbringing had left him all swollen. The mentor became angry. He thought that Bai Lan was trying to make him angry. Master Yan ordered the young man to immediately apologize to his sister apprentice. Bai immediately walked over to Tao and asked him not to take what he said to heart. Tao assured him that there was nothing wrong with it, especially since it was all business. The preceptor ordered Bai to bury those people and take the flower of water and fire. Immediately afterward, let him follow them. Bai Lan obediently turned around in the other direction and leisurely wandered to fulfill his mentor's orders. He knew that his emotions would pass anyway, and everything would be fine. Master Yan led the girl to that very cliff, and Tao asked why they were going back. The master replied that there was a magical barrier at the bottom. It would be good to inspect it. Tao looked fearfully into the dark abyss and pitifully confessed to her mentor that she still hadn't learned how to control the air currents. Master Yan smiled. It was even easier this way. You wouldn't have to keep an eye on the girl. You could just move her downstairs. The mentor smiled affectionately at the student and gave her a hand. He said he didn't see a problem with that. Tao just needed to hold on tight to her master. The girl blushed at the mere thought of having to snuggle up to her mentor. Lan was envious of her at this moment. He too wanted Master Yan to hug him tightly. Meanwhile, the mentor, as if by accident, grasped the girl's breasts firmly, slid down them, and lowered to her waist. With his other hand, the master wrapped his other arm around Tao-er's legs and intercepted higher, resting his fingers on the girl's thigh. After checking if Tao-er was holding on securely, Mentor Yan smirked and began to climb down. The girl's breath was breathtaking, and she screamed the entire time they were descending. Bai Lan soon finished his job of burying the enemy bodies and took off into free flight, catching up with the master and Tao-er. It turned out that the dark abyss at the very bottom was not dark. There was a body of clear, transparent water down there. Tao-er had known for a long time that this place was called the Illusory Sea. Master Yan was surprised that it still hadn't dried up to the bottom. The girl felt good and calm in the master's arms. She was embarrassed to realize that she felt safe around this man. Upon reaching the water level, Mentor Yan cheerfully offered to take a dip and explore what surprises awaited them underwater. They activated the protective spheres at the same time as Bai and submerged themselves underwater with a powerful surge already in the waterproof spheres. At the bottom of the sea, the travelers found an abandoned royal palace. Time had spared it, and the interior could be explored. The underwater travelers carefully surveyed the entire perimeter of the formerly regal luxury from the outside and swam to the roof of one of the structures. Yan saw that there was a breach in one of the walls of the building. When he swam inside, he paid attention to the inscribed letters, but he still couldn't make out anything. Diving into the opening, Bai Lan surfaced out of the water and suddenly discovered that things were somehow different here. The underwater palace inside was not flooded at all and could be walked on. Master Yan explained to his disciple that it was all because of the watertight barrier here. He assured Bai that it would be much easier from here on. Bai Lan was here for the first time and looked at everything with interest. In one of the galleries, he saw signs of a massacre. Many skeletons were lying on the floor with swords in their hands. The girl noticed it too and suggested that a fierce battle had once taken place in this place. Mentor Yan replied that he did. However, he himself finds it difficult to say how long ago this event took place. Tao continued to look at everything and drew the companion's attention to the giant ceilings. She said that the castle was not built for ordinary people, judging by the spans. Soon even the foreman was surprised, and he wasn't the only one. All three travelers were stunned to see one of the inhabitants of the palace. A giant of unbelievable size was sitting under the wall in the lotus posture. Even in this position, he was almost touching the ceiling of the palace. The giant's feet were at least 4 meters wide. The mentor remarked that even for him, the existence of gods in this world was news. Tao didn't quite understand him and thought that Yan was talking about people who had achieved semi-divinity. Bai Lan told the girl that she was deluded. He told her that an ordinary person on the path of perfection could stand on one of the 7 stages. After drawing the diagram and explaining in detail, Bai drew her attention to the fact that the term semi-divinity still had the character for human. Lan looked at the huge skeleton of a knight and began to talk about who those remains could belong to. Master Yan interrupted him and gave his opinion. He said that in his lifetime, that warrior was a true god. He started to reach out his hand to the knight, but something halfway there stopped him. He clenched his hand into a fist, held it briefly, and dropped it without touching the warrior. The giant in knight's armor remained seated with his head bowed forever. It was as if he symbolized the end of his era. Master Yan turned around and walked further. He suggested that they continue on their way and explore the depths of the palace. Tao-er was completely confused. Until now, she had thought that demigodhood was the highest point of development. Now she began to suspect that there was something higher. Suddenly, Mentor Yan saw something unusual. He was surprised and came even closer, but more slowly. For a while, the master observed the object. At first, Yan thought he was mistaken, but then he realized that this was the magic barrier. He ordered his companions to stop where they were. Bai Lan stopped and took a closer look. He turned pale. What the master was pointing out was something he was well aware of. The magic barrier was also known as the spirit sword barrier. It securely blocked the way forward. The magical barrier itself was a protective circle, the entire space behind which was occupied by a multitude of blades hanging in the air, aimed directly at the entrance. Mentor looked around. There seemed to be no way around it. Many men had died here trying to break through the defenses. Master Yan asked Bai to see if there was a weakness in this barrier. He asked Lan to back off immediately if he suspected anything. Bai Lan immediately reached out with his hand for the flexible silver sword that was twisted on his belt. After straightening his sword and making a couple lunges into the air, Lan smiled and reported to his mentor that his apprentice had accepted the order. Bai Lan took a few more steps, and small pebbles immediately began to fall threateningly from the ceiling. But Bai was not intimidated by this. Bai Lan approached the holographic magic barrier, from which blades protruded threateningly. The young man frowned. He realized that this wasn't going to be easy and turned pale. Bai Lan stared at the barrier, unsuccessfully trying to find a weak spot. As the young man advanced, the barrier became clearer. It vibrated threateningly and began to unleash its swords at Lan. At first, the young man was able to successfully repel all the attacks. All of the barrier's defensive blades collided with his sword and flew back, but there were more and more of them. Bayu found them harder to handle, and at one moment he realized with horror that he had missed one of them. The sword that flew out of the protective barrier sank straight into Tao's body, illuminating everything around with yellow light. The girl screamed in pain and surprise. Master Yan was angry and decided that they would definitely break the barrier now. He fended off all the attacks of the defensive blades. The frightened girl stood behind her mentor's back. She peered cautiously over her shoulder, and an exasperated Yan asked Tao Er to be more careful. He demanded to wrap his arms around him from behind and not be distracted. The girl immediately pressed herself tighter against her master and reported that his command had been fulfilled. She really felt cozy behind her master's back. The master trembled with delight. He loved these touches of the girl on his back. Master couldn't help himself and blissed out. Meanwhile, the protective barrier was releasing blades faster and faster, and it was already hard for Lan to dodge and fend them all off. Seeing the approaching threat, the mentor exclaimed that he was unable to protect Tao. He asked him to hurry up and wrap his legs around him. The girl blushed. She had already pressed herself as tightly as she could against the master. Tao was ashamed to even think about it, but the fear of danger was far greater than her embarrassment. Closing her eyes, she still embarrassedly jumped on her mentor's back, wrapping her arms and legs around him. Master Yan immediately pictured a confused koala climbing up a tree trunk, and said that Tao reminded him of this outlandish animal. Bai Lan was distracted for a moment and looked at how Master Yan was deflecting the attacks. Suddenly, he saw that he himself was in danger. Bai thought with annoyance that he was in a fierce battle and couldn't afford to be distracted even for a moment. Dodging the enemy blades spinning and twisting in the air, Bai Lan soared upwards, hoping that they wouldn't get him there. In the next moment, Lan realized that he had made a mistake and there was no way he could dodge in the air. Immediately, he made a decision. If it was impossible to dodge the attack, the only thing to do was to accelerate and fly straight ahead. It was a risky move, but there were no other options. At full speed, Bai Lan rushed towards the barrier, bypassing all the blade attacks. He was rushing too fast, and the barrier didn't have time to attack him. Bai Lan crashed into the barrier with all his might and slammed his sword into its clever weave of blades. It seemed like he had almost succeeded. Still, Bai Lan missed one or two blades and grudgingly wrinkled his nose. He realized that he wouldn't be able to overpower the protective barrier. Tao Er pressed herself against the master's back with fear. The blades flew in the air more and more violently, and everything inside her trembled with terror. But the mentor didn't pay any attention to it. He calmly fluttered among the blades like a moth, and Tao did not suffer any damage. Finally, the master landed and gently lowered the scared-to-death Tao down. The girl reluctantly let go of his back. She was still scared. Master Yan smiled and informed the trembling girl that the danger had passed. They left the affected area. Bai Lan obediently bowed his head and admitted to the master that his disciple's strength wasn't enough. He had only managed to pierce through one layer. The mentor smiled and replied that he was not yet up to the level of swordsmanship of his senior apprentice. It was not a bad result for a mortal. Master Yan explained that this protective barrier had been left by the gods after all, and Bai Lan had performed admirably. The mentor turned to Tao and reminded her that he had started teaching her the swordsmanship techniques of the 12-year cycle, and they had begun to go through the Azure Dragon cycle. Master Yan estimated that the girl should have mastered 3 styles out of the 36 styles in the cycle, and promised to give a demonstration. He unsheathed his sword and held it in front of him, pointing it upwards. The sword vibrated almost immediately, and a golden aura appeared around it. With a quick movement, The master raised the sword upwards, and a fiery image of it appeared in the air, magnified 10 times. Bailan smiled. He had seen this many times before. Tao gasped in delight. She had only heard of the origin spirit phantom before, but she had never seen it. The girl was amazed by the master's strength. She assumed that at the current moment, Mentor Yan was already at the level of semi-divinity. Meanwhile, the master concentrated his power and created a whirl of the barrier blades, making them spin. He thrust his sword upward with a powerful lunge and held the barrier's protective blades at a safe distance. Suddenly, Master Yan pointed his sword at the barrier itself, urging it to break. The full force of the barrier's blades collapsed onto its protective layer. Hundreds of blades flew across the gallery, forming one. Now it was like a fiery comet hurtling toward the barrier. Slamming into the barrier, the blades created a small crack. The barrier began to crack at the seams. The blades continued to fly and strike it. Finally, there was no trace of the barrier left. Tao exclaimed in delight that the master had succeeded. Her eyes were beaming with happiness. The passageway was indeed clear. Dust was slowly settling from the walls and ceiling. There was no trace of the magical barrier and protective blades. Entering the hard-to-open passageway, Master Yan turned pale. Now he understood why this room was so securely guarded against intrusion.